So with that, I would like to introduce Laura Wolf. She has been a wildlife biologist with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game for 13 years. She's based out of Coeur d'Alene. She works primarily with big game species such as deer, elk, moose, wolves, and mountain lions, but is really excited when she gets to work with mountain goats. Laura also works regularly with the U.S. Forest Service on large-scale habitat projects. She manages the Snow Peak Wildlife Management Area along the North Fork of the Clearwater River, which is home to a healthy herd of mountain goats. And she recently led the statewide mountain goat management plan for the state of Idaho. So with that introduction, I will turn the time over to Laura and later to Britta.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here and get to talk to you guys about my favorite wildlife species, which is mountain goats. I'm going to share my screen. How is that looking for everyone?
Looks good.
Great. So I'm going to start off with a poll question. Jump right into it. And Britta's helping with the polls. You should be able to see a poll up. We're asking folks to let me know if you've seen mountain goats in Idaho, specifically in Idaho. Just kind of curious. It's always fun when you get to see them because they are just such a unique species, a neat animal that resides across the western United States into Canada and Alaska. Looks like most people have voted. We've got 73%, 70% have seen them in Idaho, 30% have not. So quite a few folks have seen mountain goats in Idaho, which is great. And obviously there's lots of other states you can see them too. So I'm going to get started. So mountain goats are just a really unique animal. They are found in the steepest and rockiest habitats in North America. They are a generalist herbivore. They can eat just about anything, which is good because there's not a whole heck of a lot of vegetation at some of those high alpine rocky sites. And they have a really unique social structure that I'll talk about in a little bit. I'm going to throw up another slide before I get into this. Is more of a, you don't have to know the answer, but just kind of to see what you guys think. So poll question number 2 is, at what age are mountain goats mature? And by mature, that usually means at what age are they starting to reproduce? So are mountain goats fully mature by the age of 1, 2, 3, or 4? You'll see me glancing to my left because I can see the answers popping up. All right. The majority wins. So we have about half the folks guess that they mature at the age of 4, which is correct. It is quite old. Compared to most other ungulates that mature usually and have their first young at about 2, 2.5, mountain goats do not typically have their first kid until they're about 4.5 years old. So that's pretty old for an ungulate or a hooved mammal. And this graphic kind of shows the size differences from left being the full-grown adult male and female, or Billy and Nanny mountain goat, to the right where you see the young kid. So kids tend to be about 1/3 the size of an adult in their first 6 months. And even by a year old, they're still only about half the size of an adult, which is unusual. Most ungulates, like deer and elk, are close to the size of an adult by the time they're a year old. Even 2-year-old mountain goats are still considerably smaller than an adult. So you can use size to determine their age for the first couple years. But once you get past 2 and you're in the 2 to 10 age range, you really need to be able to look at their horns to determine the age. So if you see me on the side of your screen, I'm holding up a mountain goat skull. And mountain goat horns have rings just like trees do. So they have the first year, they grow the most horn. Quite a bit of their horn is grown in the first year. The second year, they grow a noticeable amount. And then after that, years 3 through however old they live, they really only grow maybe 1/4 inch or less. So those rings get really close together. But you can count them and determine how old they are by those age rings, just like a bighorn sheep has. Mountain goats look very similar, males and females do, but you can also use their horns to figure out if they're a male or a female. So males have slightly larger bases. So the very bottom part of the horn is pretty wide, and it's so wide that you would not be able to stick another horn in between the two horns. Whereas a female, which I'm holding a female mountain goat skull, females do have a little bit more space. They have narrower horns, so you could actually fit another horn in between the two. These are very slight differences though. The other thing is to look at how hooked the end of the horn is. So females tend to have a little bit more of a crook, a little hooked end to the curvature of the horn. But again, these are hard, even if you have a skull in hand, it can be somewhat tricky to determine the sex of the goat. So I always recommend watching them for a while, and if you see testicles, you know it's a male. And if you watch them urinate, you can also tell whether it's a male or female. So those are really the best ways to determine. Takes a little bit longer to watch them though. So as I mentioned, mountain goats live in just really steep, rocky habitats. Not a lot of other animals in North America live in these habitat types, and they select these areas because it is a great place to be safe from predators. When they're in the rocks, they're pretty safe from most of the large mammalian predators that may get them. They do wander off the rocks to access forage or to travel to new areas, and that's when they're at a bit more risk from predation. But they are able to find forage in these cliffy areas. The other reason that they choose these areas is that snow does not accumulate in winter, so they can move around on these rocky cliffs without having to travel through deep snow, even when they're at these really high elevations. Because alpine environments like this have a fairly short growing season, they can, if they're at very high numbers, deplete their food resources, which can take quite a while to recover. They do eat a lot of different foods though. I mean, they eat just about anything they can find at high elevation. So conifer needles, leaves, forbs, wildflowers, lichens. It's pretty much anything that they wander by, they can eat and will eat. So here's a great example of winter habitat. This picture was taken actually this last winter. This is the Cabinet Mountains just east of Scotchman in Montana. The Cabinet's in the Idaho side actually is pretty limited in terms of winter habitat, but Montana has really nice rocky cliffs from top to bottom of the mountains. One of the reasons that mountain goats are able to move around so efficiently and use these environments when other animals are not is based on their hooves. And their hooves are really interesting because they have, which the photo shows, they have a hard keratin outer part of the hoof, which would be like the hoof of a deer or a horse. But unlike a deer where the whole hoof is that hard keratin, which would make it very slippery on steep, slick rocks, the inner part of the hoof is a bit softer and actually has kind of a rough texture if you were to feel it, which provides friction when they're walking on ice or walking on slick rocks. The other really cool thing about them is that unlike a deer hoof, that the two fingers of the hoof stay, the toes basically, the toes stay together when they're walking, mountain goats are able to hold their toes out in kind of a V shape. So I'm going to ask you to try this right now. So put your two fingers together, and I can't tell if you're doing this or not, but I'm going to assume you are. Put your two fingers together and then put it on a flat surface like a table or the floor, and then just push forward, slide your fingers forward and feel how that feels. And once you've done that, then put your toes in a mountain goat V as if you're on a steep slope, and then try to push your fingers along a slope in the V. And you should notice that it is much more difficult to push forward when you have the V. So that just goes to show that when you can do that with your toes, you are providing more friction. It makes it much harder for them to slide. The other thing about the V that helps is that they can catch like little nooks, rocks, snow can get caught in the middle of the V, which can help add an additional break if the foot is starting to slide. So that helps them move around in these slick and steep rocks. They also have very powerful neck and shoulder muscles that help them climb up these steep slopes. And they can have amazing jump abilities too. They can jump as far as 12 feet. So they're pretty amazing animals to watch in the rocks. All right, we're gonna do another poll. So this map is showing mountain goat populations across the state of Idaho. The poll question is, which North Idaho mountain goat herd is an introduced herd or a non-native herd? So we have the Selkirks, Cabinets, the Bernard Peak, Lake Pend Oreille herd, and the Mallard Larkins. Those are our 4 herds in North Idaho. Just watching the votes coming in. About half the folks have voted. Yeah, we got a lot of different answers. So most folks selected the Mallard Larkins, which is the Snow Peak area south of Snow Peak. But the winner is Bernard Peak. So the goats that you can see from Bayview across the lake, across from Farragut, where the fire currently is burning, is actually our only non-native goat herd. It was actually the first translocated herd in the state of Idaho in 1960. But the Cabinets and the Selkirks and the Mallard Larkins are all native mountain goat herds that have been there as long as we know.
Hey, Laura.
Yeah.
Ken had a question. How do you decide where they are native?
So a lot of that is based on historical reports. When people were traveling through in the 1800s, where they reported seeing mountain goats and where they did not. And there were no known goats, or nobody reported seeing goats in the Bernard Peak area of all the settlers that came into, or talking to Native Americans that lived in the area at the time. So there are some places where there's a little bit of question that might even be close to, like some of the stuff in the just north of central Idaho. We have some questions as to whether or not goats are native there or not. But in the case of North Idaho, we're pretty certain as to which areas are native and which are not. Our Selkirk goat herds extend up into Canada. There's not a dividing line on the border. Same with the Cabinets; those extend into Montana, where they're very large native herds. But that's a great question, and thanks. I don't see the chat box right now, so if you can go ahead and let me know when I have questions, that would be helpful. So this map shows all the locations that we know of since 1954, and as you can see, the majority of the mountain goats reside in central Idaho in the Frank Church Wilderness. The largest mountain goat herds are in the Sawtooth and White Clouds, those 2 big bunches of red dots you see at the southern end. And then the most populous non-native herd is over by Idaho Falls on the Wyoming border. That's the Palisades herd. So as I mentioned at the beginning, one of the cool things about mountain goats is they have, I think, kind of interesting social structure and behavior compared to other ungulates like deer and elk that live in the state. Mountain goats typically are found in nanny groups. So especially the bigger groups are going to be females with young, including young billies and kids. And the adult billies will typically be separate from these herds by themselves, or maybe with 1 or 2 other adult billies. And basically, the larger and the older the mountain goat, the more dominant they are. So their social structure is based on mostly size, somewhat, which is generally correlated with age, but bigger the goat, the more dominant. And you see a lot of these social interactions less often in the billy groups, but more often in these nanny groups, where the larger nannies and the older nannies are going to be dominant, kind of the boss. They get to control the situation. The billies will come into these nanny groups to breed. Nannies are pretty intolerant of having them around for very long, so it's a very short window where they'll come in and breed in during the November rep. Mountain goats have kind of a personal bubble. It extends roughly 6 feet from their head, and they don't really like other goats to be within that bubble, their kid being excluded while they're young and nursing. So if two goats encounter each other, maybe on a ledge or on a path, the subordinate goat will let the dominant go by. But if they're roughly the same size or they're feeling cocky that day, they might not move. And so then you get into a kind of posturing situation. Now, mountain goats, as we all know, have very sharp horns that they can use for jabbing, and they do have tough rump patches to help protect from jabs that they might receive. However, they rarely use those horns with each other. They do, unlike like a bighorn sheep, which you always see, videos of rams interacting with their horns. Mountain goats are very unlikely to use their horns with another goat. That's kind of the last thing that they would do. So they do a lot of posturing, which might be moving their head to show how big their horns are. It might be standing sideways to look bigger, saying, I actually am dominant. They might poof out the hair along their legs to, again, kind of like a cat would poof their hair out to make them look bigger. And if that doesn't encourage the other goat to move along, then maybe they would kind of do a little jab. But for the most part, that's going to kind of be how this posturing works to figure out who's dominant. So I am going to read half a page from one of my favorite books, which is Doug Chadwick's A Beast, the Color of Winter, because I thought it was just a really neat description of the social hierarchy of mountain goats. So Doug Chadwick, in this book, he spent quite a few years, mostly in Canada, observing goats and recording behaviors. It's a lot of behavioral ecology. So he's watching a group of goats, watching them with his spotting scope. A fairly large group of adult nannies and immature goats lie bedded on a favorite stone turret overlooking the forest. Among them, a 3-year-old nanny I know as number 100 stretches out drowsily, chewing her cud, her kid beside her doing the same. Her head is only about 4 feet from the rump of a larger nanny who has a kid with her. But since the goats seem to measure their personal perimeter outward from their head, number 100 is safely just beyond the big nanny's trespass zone. She is, that is, until the female gets up and turns 100 degrees to rebed. Now the heads of the two nannies are not 8 feet apart, but 4 feet. What has been an association turns into a confrontation, with the big nanny staring steadily at number 100. Number 100 and her kid are forced to rise and leave. It is typical of these crag dwellers that they consider the bed of a lower-ranking companion more appealing than an unoccupied site. Number 100 accordingly walks straight over to a young billy, a 2-year-old. He gets up and after some circling and horn threats is persuaded to leave by number 100, who settles into his bed with a yawn after the usual preliminary pawing. Her kid does the same and curls up beside her, then lazily extends a foreleg and begins chewing its cud. The 2-year-old billy now heads directly for a slightly smaller 2-year-old nanny who jumps up from her bed and leaves after a quick horn toss in the billy's direction. While the billy lies down in the bed he has usurped, she is taking out her aroused aggression on a dwarf fir tree, which she thoroughly slashes. A few moments later, she is kicking a yearling male out of his bed. This displaced yearling tries to take over another yearling billy's bed spot, but is discouraged by the other's violent pawing and the rigid present threat he performs while still lying down. A present threat being kind of a, look how big I am, sideways. And so the smallest yearling in the band, hapless last link in the chain, bottom rung on the ladder, and low goat on the totem pole is left standing to pick out a new bed site. That's just one of my favorite examples of how the hierarchy works. So while most of the time goats, like most wild animals, are afraid of people and will move away, they do become habituated when fed or offered salt, either from urine deposits or people's salty backpacks and skin. These photos, courtesy of Britta, are from Scotchman Peak, people behaving poorly with the mountain goats. And unfortunately, when mountain goats are no longer acting like wild mountain goats, they let people into their personal bubble, which can sometimes turn into a problem. We did have a hiker who was injured in 2015 when he let a mountain goat get too close to him. And a hiker was actually killed in Olympic National Park in 2010 when, unfortunately, he did the right thing and was not going to give the mountain goat his sandwich. And that turned deadly. So they can be, while they tend not to use their horns, when they do, they can be quite dangerous. I'm going to turn this over to Britta because it seems like a good spot to talk about the ambassador program on Scotchman Peak.
Thanks, Laura. Like Preston and Laura said, my name's Britta Meyerly. I'm with Friends of Scotchman Peaks Wilderness. And
you speak up?
Oh, yep, sorry, I definitely can. Thank you. And this is one of the lovely goats on Scotchman Peak. As Laura was talking about, they really do, they've gotten a little bit habituated, and as it turns out, they really like salt, which is a problem. This person laid their pack down at the summit, and after hiking Scotchman Peak, you tend to get a bit sweaty, and that can lead to sweaty backpack straps and to a mountain goat carrying your pack off. And people can let them get a bit too close, including for that perfect up the snout close-up shot. So after the hiker was injured in 2015, our executive director, Phil Huff, that I think all of you know well, worked with Eric Walker, who was our district ranger on the Panhandle National Forest in the Sandpoint District at the time, and with Idaho Fish and Game, and came up with this idea for a trail ambassador program. The idea is to have volunteers hiking Scotchman Peak during the summer, on the weekends and holidays when there tend to be the most people, and talk to folks about the goats and why it's so important to keep them at a distance. And ideally, we would like to see no people taking selfies, letting the goats lick their ears. But realistically, we're looking to keep people safe and keep the trail open without having the Forest Service and Idaho Fish and Game having to take any lethal action with goats or close the trail again. Anybody can be an ambassador. This is a picture of some folks hiking a few years ago, and our trail ambassador coordinator that year, Mary Franzel, on the right. All of the ambassadors are volunteers, and we have a few of them on the call today, so thank you. Susan Bates-Harbuck is rocking the mountain goat background on her virtual background on her screen, so I appreciate that. So some of the program highlights. Since 2016, when the program first started, 82 unique people have hiked as volunteers, ambassador volunteers, and most of those people have hiked multiple times as volunteers. They have spent a total of 1,412 hours driving, hiking, sitting on the summit, talking to people, just over 1,400 hours acting in that volunteer capacity, which is a lot of time considering it was only 82 people. And I got a little crazy with infographics last night. And I made this fun one based on boots. So these are the number of hikers that the ambassadors have talked to. And we didn't count how many people they talked to in 2016 and 2017. So this is only 2018, 2019, and 2020 so far. And if you'll notice, so each boot is 300 hikers. For 2020, that's only 2 months worth of ambassador days. So 4th of July through Labor Day. We didn't start the program until July this year because of COVID and wanting to make sure we could keep our ambassadors safe. And so we wrote and implemented a COVID safety plan for all of our volunteers, including the ambassadors. But we had massive amounts of people on the trail this year. Last year, our peak day was around the 4th of July, and it was with 100 people on the trail. And this year we had 120, 130 on some days, not necessarily the 4th of July weekend. So I think we've kind of concluded that people were feeling cooped up and wanted out, and they decided to go for a hike with 100 other people. Since we started the program, there have been 0 incidents reported between mountain goats and humans, and that is a very important number to us. We want to keep it that way. We have found that since we've been doing the program long enough, we're starting to have ambassadors that aren't official ambassadors. So they've talked to the official volunteer trail ambassador that's out there, and then they see someone letting the goats get too close or approaching the goats, and they will act as an ambassador and say, no, don't do this, here's why. And so it's really starting to get that snowball effect, which is wonderful. We still have one goat that is a little more assertive than the others, but for the most part, the goats are starting to realize that maybe people aren't as easy of a target for salt as they once were. And within the last few weeks, there haven't been very many goats on the summit. The volunteers have been reporting that they're only seeing 1 or maybe no goats at all, which honestly is not a bad thing. I'm sure people are disappointed about their photo op, but it's good because that means the goats are steering clear of the people. Put my contact information up just in case, and I will, if anybody has any questions about it, but otherwise I'll just hand it back to Laura.
Thanks, Britta. One of the questions that I often get, as I'm going to attempt to reshare my screen here, is do goats need salt? And oh, look, see, ha ha. The question came in just as I was answering it. Mountain goats do need some salt, but there is enough salt in the environment that they can find. There are not like natural salt licks, so they can get salt from the environment. They just really like it. So when they're coming in to get salt, it is less about the need and more about the want. So it's like our sugar addiction, our potato chip addiction that we have ourselves. Okay. How is that looking? I'm assuming that you can see a goat on a trail. Great. Okay. What was that? Good?
Looks good.
Okay. So along the lines of mountain goats, gathering on Scotchman Peak or other places, there were researchers in Glacier National Park, which is one place that you may have seen goats if you haven't seen them in Idaho. Goats are almost always seen on the top of Logan Pass, where the Going to the Sun Road goes from the west to the east side. And the scientists were curious as to whether mountain goats were gathering there, because it's not very mountain goaty habitat right there. It's mostly meadowy. That's not much for escape terrain. It's open, and there's some steepness, but not necessarily a lot of rocks right there. Were the goats hanging out at Logan Pass because they were seeking the salt? So people obviously pee along the trail, so there's salt in the soil. Is it because they are finding really good forage, a lot of good plants for them to eat there? Or are they using humans as a predator shield? So are they coming to that area because there's so many people that there's bound to be less predators? And they had mountain goats collared and they were studying them, but they had a really unique opportunity to truly answer this question when a few years ago they had to close the Going to the Sun Road midsummer because of a wildfire. So that stopped all traffic over Logan Pass. And so all of a sudden it went from thousands of people a day to nobody for several weeks. They had determined already that the salt remained in the soil available to goats for 10 to 14 days. And what they found was that within 2 to 3 days, almost all the goats had left and gone back to the cliffs. So, and obviously the forage did not change in that time with no people around. So that they determined that goats were actually congregating at Logan Pass because they were using people as a shield. So there's less likely to have wolves, bears, and lions hanging out when you have that many people there day to day, day after day. So I think that's a really neat thing. And I think that the Scotchman Peak goats, while they're probably primarily there for the salt, they might also be using humans as a shield there as well, especially since I know there haven't been as many people hanging out during that when the smoke came in a couple weeks ago. I don't think the volunteers were hiking the trail, but I hope to goodness gosh that there weren't a lot of people hiking it either because it was pretty hazardous. And now that we're getting reports that there aren't many goats at the top, and obviously there's still going to be salt deposits around, so they may have left because the people weren't there as that protection. So mountain goats have been translocated, about 270 actually have been translocated within Idaho since 1960. Translocating or moving animals was a very popular thing with wildlife biologists in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It has definitely slowed down since then and has become much more thoughtful. This was the pictures here represent the last mountain goat translocation that occurred in Idaho. These were goats that were brought from non-native range in Utah. Goats are not native to the state of Utah. Up into the North Lemhi Mountains due south of Salmon, Idaho. And these were brought into that location because that is native range, but goats had not really been occupying that section of the mountain range for a couple decades. So we're hoping to reestablish goats in that area. Unfortunately, as is not uncommon with translocations, it seems like particularly when you're trying to bolster a declining population or bringing them back into previously inhabited range, the translocation did not go very well. Most of the goats died within the first 3 to 4 years from a variety of causes. There are still a healthy herd in the southern part of the Lemhi Range, but it just was a good example of how difficult it can be to reestablish. And perhaps the goats are not there because the forage is not sufficient at this time. Maybe at some point there were too many goats or a competition with other species that were using the same forage resources. But when we think about moving goats now, we try to make sure that forage appears to be appropriate, or we might be moving goats to bolster genetic diversity. A lot of goat herds are fairly small in number, excluding the white clouds and the sawtooths, which those herds are in the 300 to 500 range. Many of our herds could be in the 40 to 80 range, which is pretty small. As we mentioned before, there are a variety of ways that mountain goats may perish, predators being the most common, and of those mountain lions being the main predator. They do tend to also like to inhabit rocky areas and rocky outcroppings, and as a stealth predator, they are the main cause of death with mountain goats in Idaho anyway. When they wander off the rocks, they may encounter wolves and grizzly bears, and golden eagles have actually been known to take kids from rocks as well. Falls and avalanches are also not an uncommon cause of death, even though they are pretty spectacular on those rocks. It's not uncommon for them to fall or to be killed in the winter by an avalanche. Other threats that mountain goats are seeing now include climate change. I think we have a poll question here for you. So, our warmer winters, which are predicted to spread across north and most of mountain goat habitat, our warmer winters due to climate change likely to increase overwinter mountain goat survival or decrease overwinter survival? It's fun to watch people answer the poll questions. The picture here on the screen is of a mountain goat up on Scotchman this summer who was enjoying a snow patch. All right, so we've got 13 votes for decrease overwinter survival and 5 votes for increase overwinter survival. So this might be surprising, but warmer winters actually should benefit mountain goats in the wintertime. While they do live in very snowy places, they do better if there's less snow. So they don't need lots of snow like a wolverine needs snow to insulate, or a pika needs snow to insulate their dens in the wintertime. Mountain goats do not need snow to do well. However, warmer summers, and particularly warmer, drier summers, are likely to decrease survival in the summertime. So they might have an increased survival over winter because of less snow. It's going to be even worse in the summertime when they have both changes in plants. I think many of these alpine plants are going to desiccate earlier when you have these warmer, drier summers. So they're going to lose their forage earlier. And 2, they are going to be heat stressed. So mountain goats like this one here on Scotchman, they do seek out snow patches throughout the summer to cool off. And without those snow patches, they have to choose whether they seek out shade or snow somewhere else, or they stay in the place where they can find the best forage. And so making those trade-offs is going to potentially put them into poorer body condition going into the following winter. They did a study of mountain goats again in Glacier, where they found that goats were specifically seeking out these snow patches that were remaining in July and August to cool off. And when they did not have snow patches available, if they had already melted, their respiration rates were significantly higher. So that means that they're using more energy just to cool off, panting, than they would if they had a snow patch. So it is a stress for them during the summer months. This graphic is based on a model in Southeast Alaska, but I think it's pretty relevant anywhere in North America. As we know, many species are going to be moving north or up in elevation as the climate warms. And unfortunately for mountain goats, mountains are pyramid shaped and not like a skyscraper shape. So as they go up, they are going to have less habitat available to them, even if they can move up. Some of them are already at the tops of the mountains. So that is not going to be helpful. So we have habitat loss along with general physiological stress of warming temperatures. Another thing that can impact mountain goats is recreation. I'm going to throw up another poll here. Well, Britt is. Britt is going to throw up another poll. So what do you think mountain goats are most disturbed by in terms of human recreation? So ATVs, helicopters, hikers, or truck traffic? There have been a number of studies done on mountain goats and disturbance, and some of these studies are ongoing now. There's a neat study that was mostly looking at recreation use in terms of wolverine habitat in central Idaho, but it's somewhat relevant to mountain goats because they inhabit some of the same habitat types. All right, so the majority of folks, about half the folks, voted for ATVs, followed by 5 for helicopters and 4 for hikers. So the most research we have shows that they're most disturbed by helicopters. And we don't know, and we can see that too when we do surveys, which of course we try not to stay near them for more than a couple seconds. As soon as we can get a count, we're out of there. But unlike other ungulates, which don't love helicopters either, they seem to be most bothered by them. They're pretty darn good at hiding in cracks and caves where you can't even see them. They won't come back out either. They are quite bothered by helicopters. I didn't include over snow machines just because I don't know that we have a good comparison between helicopters and, let's say, snow machines or snow bikes, but mountain goats certainly do move to different areas when they're disturbed by motorized recreation. They may also move based on hikers as well, but it seems like they're more disturbed by motorized rec. They're most bothered during winter when they're in wintering areas, because that's the time of year where they use a pretty small area. They don't move around very much, and they're really just trying to conserve energy. So like you can see that sign, we have mountain goats wintering in this area, please don't recreate. Having closures can help. Biologists in the state are becoming increasingly concerned about snow bikes because they are able to access areas that snow machines never have been able to. So you can be up in a really high elevation remote basin that you wouldn't think anybody could get to, and you have snow bike tracks going just right below mountain goat cliffs. So the concern is that they might abandon the habitat altogether or just expend more energy trying to move away from that disturbance. So as Preston mentioned, we just finished the Idaho Mountain Goat Management Plan for the state of Idaho. It had not been updated in over 20 years, so it was definitely time to revisit our goals and strategies for managing mountain goats in the state. Much of the strategies involve working with the U.S. Forest Service because almost all the goats in Idaho do reside on Forest Service land. It provides guidance for wildlife managers. Mountain goats are legally harvested in the state. Currently, we have 44 mountain goat tags. But this plan moved to a much more conservative harvest strategy statewide. Mountain goats have known to be easily over-harvested for many years. I think a lot of the herds across the West were over-harvested, particularly in the 50s and 60s when there were very general open seasons. Now we still have concerns across the West. Montana's probably done the best job at documenting declines in many of their native mountain goat herds, even while non-native herds are doing well for whatever reason. And it does not appear to be related to harvest at this point because most harvest is quite low. For example, we have probably minimum 2,500, probably in the range of 3,000 goats in the state. It's a rough estimate, but we probably harvest maybe 35 goats out of 3,000 a year. So it's not likely impacting the herds at this time, but we wanted to move to a recommendation of populations being at least 100 goats before harvest was allowed. When we did this plan and it was approved by the commission, the one mountain goat tag that was in North Idaho was removed. And so not surprisingly, hunters were quite interested in how many goats we really had in the Selkirks and cabinets since we had not surveyed since 2001. So we did a survey this February and using a fixed wing, using a helicopter. We have 2 observers and a pilot, and we fly elevational contours in all the rocky habitats in the mountains. So we will just fly along all the rocky, cliffy bits up to the top, or sometimes we start at the top, go to the bottom. It's interesting. I've spent a lot of time surveying mountain goats in other parts of the state where they often are found right at the tops of the mountains on the ridge lines. But here in North Idaho, our wet snow does not allow for there to be any mountain goat habitat at the top of those mountains. You've got 12-foot cornices. So almost all the goats were found in rocky outcroppings about 1,000 feet below the ridge lines. They do obviously use the ridge lines in the summertime, but it was quite interesting because down in the central part of the state, you have, I think, much drier snow. So those ridge lines are clear of snow. Some folks like to fly mountain goats or survey mountain goats in the spring when they're on green up, where you have goats coming out into open slopes and gathering. We don't have a whole lot of that habitat here in North Idaho, so it's really beneficial to fly them in the winter when you can use tracks to help find them. You can see in this photograph When we're flying, the first thing our eyes go to are all the tracks that are running around in the cliffs. And so about the only other tracks we saw in most of this habitat were snowshoe hare tracks, which look nothing like mountain goat tracks. So it was pretty easy to say, okay, there's definitely a goat here. So you have to look close, but if you can squeeze your eyes into the lower of those two big rocks and you'll see two goats. There might be more in this picture. I'm trying to look, but there's at least two. Oh, there's three. There's actually three tucked in on that lower rock. So we counted 57 mountain goats in the Selkirks, which was considerably higher than the 2001 count of 34 goats. So of interest, I talked a little bit about translocation before. So there were actually 31 goats that were moved from Snow Peak area, just north of the Mallard Larkins, into the Selkirks between 1980 and 1994. And when we counted them in 2001, we counted 34. So there were almost no more than what had been translocated into the Selkirks. We counted 57 this time. I feel like not only did we probably do a bit more of a complete survey, but the population does appear to be increasing. So that is really good news. Recruitment was 12 kids per 100 adults. So like I mentioned earlier, it's really hard to sex a goat to determine if it's a male or female. You pretty much, I mean, I don't know if I've ever been able to do it from a helicopter. So we look at recruitment in terms of how many kids per adults, and 12 is a little bit less than we'd like to see, but of course it can be quite variable from year to year. So we flew from the Canadian border down to Toothmouth Creek where we found goats. Goats have never been seen south of Harrison Lake that I know of. There's been no reports, which is interesting. It looks like really good mountain goat habitat in the summer, but maybe the winter habitat is not nearby, so they don't hang out there very often. And then there's quite a few goats in the Farnham Ridge area between Parker Ridge and Ball Creek, just off the Kootenai Valley, which is kind of unique. And those goats are seen alongside mule deer and moose, so they're kind of intermixed in that spot.
Hey, Laura, we have a quick question from Molly. Sure. Are drones a possible replacement, full or partial, for helicopters in surveying?
That's a really great question. So the state of Idaho has been really looking into all sorts of other ways to survey wildlife, because helicopters are not only expensive and bothersome, but they're actually the most dangerous thing that a wildlife biologist does. We are flying in, low to the ground, slow in winter mountains, so it's a dangerous thing to do. Currently, there are restrictions on drones that require you to be within a mile line sight of the drone. So it would not be at this time a viable option, but it is certainly something that is on the table, and I can imagine that we would probably use drones for some wildlife surveys in the future. The one thing that's tough about a drone is that when we're flying, sometimes, a lot of times you're seeing tracks, and then you're having to kind of track back to find the goat. Is it one goat? Is it three? Is it a nanny with a kid? So with a drone, you would have to be like live, watching the video and directing the drone to be able to effectively find the animals that you're looking for. Not to say, I'm sure that will be possible at some point, but we're not quite there yet.
Follow up from Phil.
Yeah.
Montana has used fixed wing aircraft for the Cabinet Mountain surveys. Would that be better?
No. Helicopters are the best. You have the best visibility. And so I'm going to go back to the picture. Oops, too far. The bubble ship, these Bell 47s or Hillers have the absolute best visibility of anything. When you're in a fixed wing, you have much smaller windows. You can't really see as much down. You're in these steep, cliffy areas. So sometimes you're looking for things that are right below you. So in this ship, you can see, I'm the person in the orange right there. You can see below your feet. So you have really good visibility. Sightability in other ships, other types of helicopters are not as good. So when we compare this survey to the one done in 01, we were using a different kind of helicopter that didn't have as good a visibility, which may have been part of the reason the number was a bit lower. And in a fixed wing, you have even less visibility. You have to fly faster, and you can't fly as low. So you're more apt to miss animals. It can be, I feel like Montana does a lot of fixed wing flying, and they can get maybe rough trend estimates on goats and deer and elk, but it's not very accurate. So we also flew the Cabinet Mountains. We saw 11 mountain goats, which was a few less, but similar to the count in '01, which was 16 goats. The majority of the mountain goat habitat and the mountain goats are in Montana. So typically when Montana flies the cabinets, they count in the West cabinets, they count in the range of 50 or 60 goats. And then there's even more in the East cabinets. So I knew that there weren't that many in Idaho. And obviously we even see more in the summertime. So they come over in the summer. And I mean, I think even this summer up at Scotchman, people were seeing 16 goats in a day. And it was funny because, you know, the Montana-Idaho border is straight, and you wouldn't think that there would be like a big difference between one side of the line and the other. But man, that picture I showed earlier when we were talking about the hooves, that was just like right across the border, and it was like, bam, all this mountain goat habitat. I'm like, oh, that's why they're all over in Montana. It's just much more high quality habitat there. So
I have another question about the numbers of goats from Pam. How many up Lion Creek at Priest Lake?
Oh, Pam, I don't know if I can answer that. I could look it up for you and give you an answer later if you want to put your email in the chat box. But I was on that flight too. I'm like trying to remember. It wasn't more than 10 probably, but we definitely saw scattered groupings of them, 8 to 10 maybe. And that's all I have. So I'm happy to take more questions that you guys have come up with over the course of this hour. But I'm happy to, it was really fun to be able to talk to you about goats. I never turned down an opportunity to talk about them because I think they're really neat and I enjoy them quite a bit. And you're always welcome to either shoot me an email or give me a call at the Fish and Game office in Coeur d'Alene. And if you have any questions or if you have sightings. So one thing, that map that I showed earlier with all the mountain goat observations, we have a wildlife observation page on our Fish and Game website. And we will take observations of anything, any wildlife you see that particularly that's notable. If you have a photograph, that really helps to validate tracks validate the sighting. But so when we get location, a lot of those locations were from general public or other biologists that don't work for Fish and Game that had seen goats, and that helps us with management of all sorts of species. So,
Kate, we've got questions coming in the chat. Are there
if I can pull up the chat
between mountain goats and bighorn sheep?
Ooh, that's a good question. I wish I could find the chat box, but I can't.
If you stop sharing your screen, you'll be able to see it.
Oh, okay. I'll do that then. Oh, there you go. I was like, no wonder I couldn't see it. Yes. So on native range, there typically doesn't tend to be a ton of overlap. And even if there is, I wouldn't say that there are conflicts. Where there are conflicts are places like the Palisades in eastern Idaho, Wyoming, where mountain goats were introduced and bighorn sheep are native. And mountain goats have done very well there and are now expanding into the Tetons where they're not native and they're going to be competing with habitat and forage for bighorn sheep. So that's where we run into problems. Or, well, this is not between bighorn and mountain goats, but like Olympic National Park has just been spending the last couple of years trying to remove mountain goats from the park because they're not native, and they're there competing with other native mammals, but particularly the concern is with a lot of sensitive plant species that reside at the higher elevations of Olympic. And they were likely introduced, gosh, maybe around the turn of the century, the teens, maybe the 1920s. And they expanded to 700 goats or more. I mean, just amazing expansion. All right, so next question. In translocating, have there been studies of whether the unfamiliar habitat is a major cause of mortality? Normally, a goat grows up learning its home range from infancy with mentoring. Yeah, that's a really good question. There haven't, but I would guess that that is probably not the problem, because we have had so many translocations, like almost all the non-native herds in Montana, like we talked about the Palisades, those goats just exploded. Like they did really, really well in these new habitats, or the Olympics, or there's goats, all the goats in Utah. Like it was a spot where they'd never been. They didn't seem to have a problem with not knowing the range. So that's why my guess is that it has more to do with the habitat forage-wise, like what, or maybe if there's high predator numbers in those areas, like the goats that we moved into salmon, many of them were killed by mountain lions. Mountain lion numbers were high. So it could be a combination of not really knowing where you are, and then you're eaten by a predator because you don't know where to go, or you don't know where the good, escape terrain is. It could be part of it, but it seems like that's not a major component.
I think there were some above too.
Okay, let's. Yes. Okay. Yeah. So I get very excited when wildfires start in the Panhandle, because for the most part, those fires are really good for wildlife habitat. But that is not a spot that I really wanted to see a fire. That is a really steep, dry hillside. And where the fire started, much of what burned is actually a lot of that mountain goat habitat there. I would imagine that that is not going to be beneficial. Though their numbers appear to be down from their peak probably in the 1970s, but I would imagine that a hot fire in late summer is probably not going to be super useful for mountain goats there. I was told those goats were translocated from Hurricane Ridge in the Cascades. I'm not sure. They were translocated from
the Lion Creek goats.
Right. I think. No, this is the. I think she's talking about the Olympics. So the Olympic goats, the last couple of summers, they were trying to catch as many goats as they could and move them into native range in the Cascades, where they want to bolster declining populations. So I think they've moved close to 300 goats from the Olympics to the Cascades, which is really impressive. So they were going to catch as many as they could via helicopter before they moved to other methods of removing the goats. You get to a point where you can't safely catch a goat, and for the goat's sake, or for the people who need to put the goat in a sling, there's a lot of steep country in the Olympics. So I think that their next, once they got all the goats they could get via helicopter, they were offering limited hunter harvest. All right. Someone wants to see the map. So I'm gonna grab the map real quick. I'm gonna put the map back up. Britta, would you do questions for me? Because I won't be able to see it again.
Yep. Are there any future issues around forage quality with climate change?
I should think so. Here, let me share my screen here. Oh, my map. There we go. I expect so, and I think that's going to be an issue with many native, especially ungulate species, but probably most herbivores. I think that, like we've been having the last 5 to 10 years, these long, particularly dry, like this summer was not really hotter than average, but it was much drier than average. So you've got vegetation that is drying out much earlier than it normally would. You don't have any of these like late summer, early fall rains to perk things back up. So I think that that's going to negatively impact a lot of species going into winter if they can't get their forage. If all the vegetation is available like May, June, and by mid-July you don't have much, you're going to have a hard time building up enough body fat to make it through winter.
Okay, another question. We had a local plane owner who was buzzing the slope on Bernard on an almost daily basis, flying from lake level up the slope. Was that dangerous to the goats, and where should that behavior be reported?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I'm sure they don't like that at all. I mean, given that they don't like helicopter disturbance, they probably would. Once in a while, it would not be a problem, but if it's a daily occurrence, it certainly would be an issue. That's a really good question as to who to report it to. I don't know who regulates that, if the Forest Service could do anything. I mean, I don't know if we at Fish and Game, if we knew who it was, we could certainly, call and ask them not to do it, but I can't say that it's illegal to do. I don't know if that's a good answer because I'm not really sure I can answer that very well.
No more questions actively coming in.
Okay.
Or we might be out of questions here, and might be a good point to conclude. And thank you very much for this presentation on behalf of the Kinnikinnick Native Plant Society. We really appreciate you sharing all this information about mountain goats with us. And for everyone who's still online with us, there will be a recording of this that will be put up on YouTube in the coming days. And so if you have friends that haven't seen it, direct them to that. We'll send that out to everyone. So if there's no other questions, wish everybody a good weekend.
Thanks. I appreciate everyone being here and interacting and sharing your Saturday morning with me.